A little bit about the runes and whether the runes are useful in retrieving some aspects of Old Norse religion or not. I must say from the start that I do think that there is a lot of fuzz going on about runes in general. I've seen dozens, maybe hundreds of sites using runes as the main source for Old Norse religion, with, of course, all kinds of definitions and patterns and indications about how to use rune magic. That's, well, far-fetched to say the least, because runes were not really inherently magical. They're rather an alphabet, or they were used to make out several alphabets. The oldest one being the Elder Futhark from about 160 AD, and then we have the alphabet of Old Norse since the 800s. But with regard to their magical use or their mythical use, it's rather a matter of content than the string of words, because you can find inscriptions with incantations, curses, and more often healing magic. So if you look at Swedish amulets from 1000, for example, you can find something like Bovis prayer to Thor, in order to cure him for some foulness on his skin. And Thor does appear to be a more popular god among common folk, like regular people, than Odin. All right, so if you find lists with runes, with stuff like this rune represents wealth and this rune is used to invoke love and that rune is used to invoke whatever, it's not really based on a lot here. However, we do have some hints that maybe runes were also used in themselves in order to invoke something, but that's again with a very big question mark. We have, for example, the so-called Alu inscriptions. The Alu inscriptions, well, it doesn't really mean something, this inscription, so that's why generally scholars tend to believe it is ritual, magical in nature. It may, however, etymologically have to do with an old root meaning amulet. So people just writing on bracteates. Bracteates were like these coin shape small medallions used during the migration times, and maybe people were just using them to say what the object was. It wouldn't have been that uncommon. Runes do tend to have a meaning, a particular meaning, again, for the upper class. We also have a reference in a poem called Sigurdrivumol. It is a poem from the cycle of the Volsungs. It is this cycle with the hero Sigurd, and the hero Sigurd saves the Valkyria Brunhild, was being punished by Odin by not being able to get out of her armor, being punished because she didn't choose a warrior he wanted her to choose, or something like that. And then Sigurd rescues her, and she's like, okay, I'm gonna show you how to use these runes, because they are runes of power, and you're going to be able to do great things with them. Perhaps the most relevant or at least compelling source for the meaning of runes, in the sense of sacred knowledge possessed by somebody in the upper class, like a king, would be in the sayings of the High One, being the second poem of the Poetic Edda. I will talk a little bit about that a little later. We have an initiatory stance here where Odin describes how he acquired knowledge. So we have here this idea that being able to write, so having knowledge about a writing system in general, would be a domain of authority and kingship. You know, it is about mystical wisdom, but in itself, the performative act of writing is in itself mystical. So you don't need to go further on. So for time reasons, I'm just gonna tell you the translation of that without reading it in Old Norse. So the poem in stanzas 137 and 140 describes how Odin gained knowledge, and he talks about a self-sacrifice. So he says in stanza 137, for example, that he knows he hung on a wind-swept tree, and he did that 9 long nights. He was pierced by a spear and was given to himself, so given to Odin, on that tree whose roots grow in a place no one has ever seen. Probably a reference to Yggdrasil, the world tree. And then he goes on to describe the price of the sacrifice, that no one gave him food and no one gave him drink. And in the end, he looked down and he took the runes, took them screaming. So in this magical act, and then he fell, and afterwards he learned 9 spells from the son of Bolthorn and the father of Bestla. These are creatures, part of the cosmogonical myth. And then he also goes on to say that he won a drink from the mead, the famous mead of poetry. So again, we have this reference of to gaining sacred knowledge. Very important in the overall image this god has in Norse mythology. Okay, a little bit about Skaldic poetry and its importance in retrieving some aspects of Old Norse religion. Skaldic poetry is important particularly because of the fact that it is closer to the Viking Age than many other sources. It is a very complicated art form from the 700s. It's based on older forms of Germanic poetry, very alliterative in its structure, and therefore very difficult to construct. It's recognizable by its very convoluted patterns, and it is mostly recorded in Icelandic manuscripts. Why is it relevant to Old Norse mythology in particular? Because of the metaphors. They're very complicated metaphors used by poets, the so-called kenningar. For example, we have here the Karlevi stone. I think I mentioned it before. It is a stone in memory of somebody called Sibi, and it is it has a stanza preserved in a form of rhyme known as the Drottkvætt. So the kingly verses or something like that. Anyway, something related to kingship and authority at any rate. So in this verse, and this is very unusual because it's actually written on a runestone, and Skaldic poetry, yeah, like I said, doesn't really appear on runestones. And we have here, for example, a metaphor Thrud's battle tree. It's a metaphor, a kenning for chieftain. And we also have something a little more complicated than that. We have a name of Odin, for example, Vidur, Vidur of the carriage of the sea kings. Endil, which was a giant, something about a mighty dominion rule. It's something very convoluted, but also referring to the chieftain. So apparently this had some kind of political and religious significance, because kings employed poets. It was a very important job at the time to be employed at the court of a king and to write about the king. To compose eulogies. It was a tool in legitimizing power, and it remained popular until about the 13th century, when it started being replaced by chivalric romances, for example, or at any rate poetry inspired by the continent. Which brings us to our friend Snorri, who wrote extensively on Norse mythology. And he might have done so, might have decided to write about Norse mythology after paying a visit to Norway in 1218, and coming to the conclusion that people have started to forget the ancient art of poetry. So he decided, as a consequence, to write the Prose Edda, which is basically conceived as a manual on poetry and how to use poetry as a reaction to these new literary developments. This Snorri guy is probably also the author of Heimskringla, the orb of the world, the history of the kings of Norway, and he also had the political interest, by the way, in writing all this stuff, because he was involved in some very brutal and problematic struggles in Iceland in the 13th century for domination on the island. And the consequence of this problematic period was the fact that Iceland lost its independence, but that's another story. All right, so he basically wants to explain the metaphors using Norse mythology, because he came to the conclusion that people no longer understand them. Which brings us to the most important part of his work. The first part of his work is called the Gylfaginning, the deception of King Gylfi. It was probably added later as a frame. The longer part of this work is the Skålskaparmål, the art of poetry, the art of creating a skaldic material, where he teaches poets on how to do that. And then he also has a piece, Hotatal, where he explains the different types of rhymes. This work was very important. It is found in several manuscripts, for example, in the Codices Upsaliensis, Regius Wormianus, and Trajectinus. And if you read the work, you are going to come to the conclusion that he must have had access to a lot of oral knowledge, or maybe some other manuscripts which are lost to us, because he has a lot of quotations which are not really retrievable from other sources, which is why, despite the fact that he had a particular religious affiliation and political interest, the source is still interesting for us who deal with Old Norse mythology and religion. His Christian approach is very visible in the prologue, because in the prologue he basically designates the Norse gods as being humans migrating from Asia, migrating from Troy. He euhemerizes them, so turns them into humans. It's actually a concept he gives up later on. It's a concept he also uses somewhere else in the Ynglinga saga, for example, which is a legendary saga about the kings of Sweden who have lineage going back to the god Freyr. What does he want to do with all this stuff? Well, he basically wants to offer us a very structured version of Norse myth, a very compact one, and understandable one. So he's very influenced, like I said, about this Christian view of the world, and later on we have this this whole obsession with taxonomy that keeps developing. So the need to have everything very organized, the need to have, for example, certain functions linked to certain gods. And what Snorri is attempting to do, and what we are attempting to do, actually would have probably been very strange for Vikings and the people before the late Iron Age Scandinavians, in that structured versions of myths would probably not have existed at all. Moving on, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the other source, which is the more important source, because it is poetry. And because it is poetry and it is written in this very complicated, convoluted form, it would have meant that people actually needed to remember what was being said. And because of that, this oral tradition, despite being written down in the 13th century, actually has some pretty high chances of being very old and very close to the Viking Age. This is also provable by the fact that we have some errors in the manuscripts, in alliterative forms, for example, some letter and sound that do not fit, and it was probably another sound like 300 years ago, and this is how you can actually tell that the poems are older than the 13th century. So the Poetic Edda is to be found particularly in one manuscript, which is the Codex Regius, so the book of the kingly book, Konungsbok, and this book was delivered in the 17th century to the Bishop of Skalholt. It was initially attributed to a historian by the name of Simondur, but yeah, after that it wasn't attributed to him anymore. It's actually a collection of anonymous poems. You can find it in other manuscripts as well, or at least some of the poems you can find in other manuscripts, and there are also poems which are not found in the Codex Regius but found in other manuscripts. And I mentioned here the Codex Wormianus or Ormsbok, the Flateyjarbók, and the Hauksbok. Sometimes there are essential differences, and I'm going to give you an example a little later. What do these poems contain? Well, mostly mythology, and generally speaking, some wisdom about how to live your life in accordance to the old customs or old traditions. Why this book exists? Well, that's also an interesting question. I presume it was about an antiquarian interest here at stake. So also something related to cultural memory, because these poems were, you know, written down very late, and on the other hand, like I said, some of them, if you look at the language, are definitely archaic. For example, I think the oldest one, or at least some of the oldest, among the oldest ones, we have the poem Atlakvida. This is actually not a poem about the gods. It is a poem about in the cycle of the heroes. It is with reference to Atli, which is a Norse name for King Attila. So it has to do with this Germanic cycle, continental Germanic cycle of the Nibelungs, Volsungs, with the hero Sigurd in its center. At any rate, without going further into details, we have the linguistic features suggesting the archaic nature of at least some of the poems, and then we also have in particular one poem, the Rikstula, talking about social conventions which were not specific to Iceland but were specific to Scandinavia, so in particular to Norway. And this is also a hint to the fact that there was some kind of oral transmission, and at some point some Christian authors decided that they were either important for cultural memory or the sheer curiosity, and they started writing them down. These poems are written in Old Norse, but they are written in the Latin alphabet, so not in runes, and they are mainly poems about gods and also about heroes, and the poems about the heroes are mainly about the cycle of the Volsungs, and also some poems about the hero named Helgi. Okay, so you are going to find a lot of complex meters in Eddic poetry as well as in Skaldic poetry. So you're going to find, for example, Fornidislag, which is used to talk about very old stories, or when you have dialogues with Odin, you are going to find the Ljodahotter and the Molahotter in conversation. So mostly these alliterative forms depend on the context, so they're really part of the way mythology and religion are expressed in these poems. Noteworthy is also the fact that we have a lot of prose, prologues, interjections, and epilogues, and even marginal notations in many of these poems, which lead us to believe that there was some kind of performative value to them. So probably at least some of them were also used not only in the sense of being recited at some kind of festival or at the court of a king or a chieftain, but maybe some of them were even played, as in a play, a theater play. For example, the quarrel between Loki and the other gods. There is a poem about that. So these hints again reinforce this idea that mythology, these stories had a function in court, and they were related to the exercise of power. And this might be a reason why they survived at all. Among the most important poems, I offered here a couple of examples, and I'm going to briefly discuss some of them. We have the Völuspa, the prophecy of the seeress, the sayings of Odin, also called the High One, so the Hovamol, the lay of Vafthrudnir, Vafthrudnismol, the lay of Grimnir, which is another name for Odin, Grimnismol, Loki's quarrel or wrangling, Lokkasena, the lay of Alvis, Alvismol, the lay of Skirnir, Skirnismol or for Skirnis, the lay of Völund or Völundarkvidam, the lay of Thrym or Thrimskvidam, the lay of Rig, Rigstulam, the lay of Helgi Hjorvatsson, Helgakvida Hjorvatssonar, the lay of Sigurdrifa, Sigurdrifumol, Helgakvida Hundingsbana 1 and 2, the other poems about the hero Helgi. And many other poems with reference, like I said, to the cycle of the Volsungs, such as Fofnismol, the lay of Fofnir. I repeat, these are only some of them which fit the slide. Okay. And a little bit about some of them. Perhaps the most important one would be the Völuspa. This is the prophecy of the Volva, the prophecy of the seeress. It is the poem that starts the Poetic Edda, and it is contained in the Codex Regius in the Hauksbok, and it is also quoted quite extensively by the author Snorri. It is basically a conversation between Odin and a dead seeress, and it's a poem with a lot of allusions, and we need to have here some kind of we need to speculate a little bit here about what these allusions actually mean, because it's a very difficult poem to understand, and it's not the only one sharing this problem. Very important here is the figure of the seeress of the Volva. It is a vital mythological figure, and not only in Norse mythology, you can also find this figure earlier on. For example, Tacitus mentions such a figure when talking about the Bructeri tribe, the witch Veleda, and it comes up also later on in the sagas of the Icelanders. For example, we have a seeress Thorbjörg performing a ritual because the people were suffering from a bad harvest. But then again, you can see that there is a difference between Tacitus writing in the 100 AD and whatever memories Icelanders had in the 30th century about such a figure. So again, the problem of continuity. But anyway, what we have here as a common element is this divinatory trance. So you have a woman, an elderly woman, going into a trance and then finding answers to vital questions. And this aspect is linked to circumpolar concepts of magic. So speaking of the link between Viking and Sami traditions. It is an important source for both cosmogony and eschatology, this poem, because we find references to how the world was made, Ginnungagap, for example, and then the creation of the primordial giant Ymir, and then you also have references to eschatology. So there is a lengthy description of the signs preceding the Ragnarok, and of what happens during Ragnarok itself, and how the world is going to be revived. And speaking of the world being revived, there is a long debate going on about the potential Christian influence. And whereas in the Codex Regius this may or may not be confirmed, we do have another version in the Hauksbok manuscript actually mentioning the fact that someone important is going to arrive at the end of the world and restore it. And this is more than certain a reference to the figure of Jesus Christ. Okay, what is characteristic for this poem? It has a lot of vivid pictures and impressive ones. Also, this whole image about the world falling apart is dominated by the idea of fate, the idea um, that your trajectory in life, including the gods, cannot be changed, and it is only a matter of revealing itself to you, and you just have to accept it, and with that also accept the end of all things. um, there is also the theory that this might have been the work of a heathen poet, potentially potentially in contact to already converted Christian, in this case Celtic population. Thus, we have some kind of dialogue between the Christian and the Norse tradition, although yeah, the fact that you have these elements talking about revival is not necessarily a clear evidence that it was a Christian influence. The poem seems to be very old, because you find some reference to it in Skaldic poetry as well, and this has a clearer date. So, for example, you have the Skald Arnor using similar imagery in the 11th century. Without further ado, let's look a little bit at the structure of the poem. So you have a beginning with the recitation. So Odin basically begs this woman, the Volva, to talk to him about the world. So again, we have this image of Odin trying to figure out stuff, trying to know more about the world. This thirst for knowledge, which is characteristic for this particular god. Then you have reference to the creation of the world. Very interesting is the list of dwarves after after the creation of the world. Why it is here is very difficult to say. Then we also have a reference to the creation of men by a triad of gods. And then you also have the image of Yggdrasil, the world tree, and of course the very compelling image of the Nornir, the so Urd, Verdandi, and Skuld, the three Norns, not depicted here with this classical imagery of working on a loom in order to weave fate. This is found in another source actually, and the evidence for it is quite flimsy. They're just depicting writing fates on carving the fates on pieces of wood in runes, as a matter of fact. Okay, very important in this cosmogonical order is the first war between the Asir and the Vanir. This is usually interpreted as um, the domination of one older group of gods, potentially associated with the fields and fertility. These would be the Vanir, and they are afterwards dominated by the Aesir, by this part of the pantheon rather linked to ideas of kingship and elitehood. The problems start with the death of Balder. So beginning with stanza 32, and this happens as a result of the machinations of the god Loki, who tricks the blind deity Hodr in killing his own brother Balder. And then we have a representation of the underworld, which serves as a prelude to Ragnarok. And Ragnarok is depicted with these very gigantic, compelling images with, for example, brothers starting fighting each other, and then you also have some roosters announcing the end, and then things start moving with Loki coming up in front of a ship made out of nails. So all kinds of yes, this imagery which suggests total destruction. And then you have again these struggles between the gods and all kinds of figures associated with chaos and destruction. For example, the god Odin himself is going to be swallowed by the wolf Fenrir at the end. The poem, however, ends on a, yeah, let's say happy note, because there are some gods who are actually coming back. The sons of Thor, for example, as well as some of the children of Odin as well, and they get to erect another hall by the name of Gimle. And on the other hand, the element of destruction and chaos is not completely gone, because you have, for example, the dragon Nidhogg still gnawing on the world tree. So whether this is a cycle or a series of cycles is quite difficult to say.